My name is Arthur, and for 43 years, my life has been a carefully constructed lie. To everyone in the small towns bordering the Manistee National Forest, I was just the best damn tracker in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a ghost in the woods who knew the deer trails better than the deer themselves. They saw the rifle, the quiet focus, the venison I'd share in the fall. They saw a hunter, but I wasn't hunting deer. I was hunting something else. Something my father saw right before he vanished in these same woods when I was just a boy. I'm confessing this now because the silence I've kept is finally heavier than the guilt, heavier than the snows of a dozen winters. This story isn't for fame or to be believed. It's a weight I have to set down before it crushes me completely. It's the truth of what happens when a man's grief becomes a compass, and it leads him somewhere he was never meant to go. And I'm going to tell you everything. I'll take you down the trails I walked, make you feel the cold that seeps into your bones, and I'll lead you to the final, terrible moment of my hunt. The moment I finally cornered the thing I'd spent a lifetime searching for. The creature they whisper about in bars and around campfires. The one they call the Dogman. My whole life has been a ritual of tracking. A relentless pilgrimage driven by the hole my father's disappearance tore in my world. He walked into this forest and never walked out. No body, no note, no trace, except for a story a frightened logger told about a wolf that walked like a man, seen near my father's last known location. For 43 years, that story has been the engine of my life. I learned the woods not for sport, but to read a language I thought could give me an answer. Now, I have it. And it's nothing like I imagined. My credibility isn't in my words. It's etched into the very fabric of this forest. I can give you the coordinates to my cabin, 44.19 north, 85.88 west, tucked away in a hollow the topographical maps barely register. I can tell you my rifle is a pre-1964 Winchester Model 70 in .30-06, a gun my father taught me to shoot with, its stock worn smooth by my own hands and the Michigan rain. I can give you the specific blend of scent block I've perfected since 1982, a paste of bear grease, pine sap, and crushed charcoal that smells more like the forest floor than the forest itself. These aren't just details, they are the anchors of my life, the proof that I am not a man prone to fantasy. I am a man of routines, of observable facts, of the tangible world. I believe what I can see, smell, and track. And what I tracked defies everything I thought I knew about the world. My knowledge of this place is my curse. These woods have rules. They have a rhythm. You learn to hear it in the frantic chatter of a red squirrel that signals a hawk overhead, or the deep, guttural croak of a raven that means a carcass is nearby. You feel it in the air pressure dropping before a storm, a palpable weight in your lungs. My life was governed by this symphony. I knew every creek bed, every game trail, every stand of old-growth oak. This forest was my church and my prison, and I knew its scripture by heart. The patterns were everything. Predictability was survival. That's why, when the pattern broke, the silence was louder than any scream. It was a late October morning, the air sharp with the promise of an early frost, the kind of day that usually makes the woods come alive, with creatures foraging frantically before the first snow. But not that day. That day, the music stopped. It started with the silence, not quiet, silence. A dead, pressurized void that felt like the world was holding its breath. The usual forest symphony, the squirrels, the jays, the constant rustle of unseen life in the undergrowth, was gone. It was like walking into a soundproof room. I stopped, listening, every nerve on fire. The air itself felt wrong. It was heavy, and it tasted of iron and ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. But there was no storm. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. I've been in the path of bears. I've stared down a cornered wolf. I've felt the primal fear of being lost in a whiteout. This was different. This was a holy kind of wrong. It was a silence that felt like a presence, a warning. This place was no longer neutral. It had taken a side. That's when I found her, a mature doe, lying in a small clearing. At first, I thought it was a clean kill, maybe a cougar. But as I got closer, the wrongness solidified into stark, physical reality. She was torn apart, but not in a way any predator I know would do it. It wasn't the work of a bear, which would have mauled and scattered the remains. It wasn't a wolf pack, which would have been messy, with tracks everywhere. This was deliberate. The rib cage was cracked open with immense force, the pieces bent outwards. It wasn't ripped into, it was opened. The scene was eerily clean, with surprisingly little blood on the surrounding ground, as if the life had been drained from it with a horrifying efficiency. A deep, instinctual part of me knew this wasn't about hunger. This was about something else. Then I saw the tracks. Beside the doe, pressed deep into the damp earth, were paw prints, but they were impossible. They had the shape of a canine paw, the 4 distinct toes and the pad, but they were the size of a dinner plate. I laid my hand in one, and my fingers didn't even reach the edges of the impression. But the size wasn't the most disturbing part. It was the stride. The tracks were in a straight line, one in front of the other, with a gait of nearly 6 feet between them. Whatever made these prints wasn't running on 4 legs. It had been walking, on 2, walking with a weight and a purpose that spoke of intelligence. This was it, the logger's story from all those years ago. The impossible thing my father might have seen, a wolf that walks like a man. In that moment, my entire life came to a single point, a crossroads in the silent woods. I could turn around, I could go back to my cabin, bolt the door, and spend the rest of my days trying to forget the impossible print in the mud. I could let the mystery of my father's death remain a dull, manageable ache. It was the sensible choice, the sane choice, or I could follow. I could step onto the trail that had been waiting for me for 43 years, a trail my father started but couldn't finish. The air was cold, the sun was sinking, and the silence around me felt like a dare. To go back would be to admit my entire life had been a waste. To go forward was to abandon the world of reason and step into the legend itself. The woods have rules, and a new one was being written right in front of me. I chose to follow. I didn't even think about it as a choice. It felt like breathing, inevitable. I checked the wind, adjusted the rifle on my shoulder, and took the first step, placing my own boot beside the impossibly large track. With that step, the world I knew, the world of deer hunts and logging disputes and quiet seasons, fell away behind me. The only thing that mattered was the trail ahead. The forest was no longer a familiar map. It was a question, and each unnatural footprint was a word in a sentence I had to finish reading. I wasn't Arthur the Tracker anymore. I was my father's son, finally on the right path. And I made a silent promise to whatever was at the end of that trail. I wouldn't stop. Not this time. No matter what it was, no matter what it cost, I would see its face. But the forest, as I said, has its own rules. And I was about to learn that I was no longer the hunter. I was a piece in a much older game. As I followed the tracks deeper into the uncharted parts of the Manistee, a strange feeling began to creep over me, a feeling of being watched, but not with malice. It felt like I was being tested, permitted. The trail was too easy, the signs too clear, as if the creature knew I was following and was leading me on purpose. This wasn't a hunt. It was an invitation, an appointment that had been set for me before I was even born. I began to understand that every trade has a price, every answer requires a sacrifice. This was the unwritten rule of these woods. A trade is a trade, and I was about to find out what I would have to give up to get my answer. That decision, to follow those tracks, was the beginning of the end of my life as I knew it. It cost me my peace, my sanity, and my connection to the world of men. But it also gave me the one thing I had spent a lifetime searching for: the truth. It's a heavy thing, the truth. It has a life of its own, and once you have it, you can't ever really put it down. If you've ever felt a pull like that, an obsession you couldn't explain, or a question that haunted your every waking moment, then maybe you'll understand. If you do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone you know who understands that some mysteries demand to be solved. You need to stay until the very end, because what I found in those woods doesn't just change my story. It changes the rules of the world you think you live in. I followed the tracks for a week. The forest grew dense, unfamiliar. The game trails fading into nothing but the creature's purposeful path. The sense of being watched never left me, but it changed. It was less like the gaze of a predator and more like the heavy quiet of a judge. I was being evaluated. The trail led me high into the Huron Manistee's more rugged, unlogged sections, places where the maps are marked with blank spaces and warnings. I pushed myself, rationing my food, sleeping in short, fitful bursts, my rifle always within arm's reach. The obsession had taken over completely. My body was just a machine carrying my will forward. The silence that had started it all returned, but now it was a constant companion. The woods were holding their breath, waiting for a verdict. And then, the verdict came, not from the creature, but from the sky itself. A trade is a trade, and the forest was about to demand its first payment. The storm hit without warning. The sky, a clear, sharp blue 1 hour, was a bruised, churning gray the next. A freak blizzard, the kind that makes headlines. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a physical force, tearing through the pines with a sound like a freight train. Then the snow started, not as gentle flakes, but as a blinding, horizontal wall of white. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 0. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The temperature plummeted. It was a complete whiteout. I tried to backtrack, but my own tracks were gone, erased in seconds. The world vanished, replaced by a roaring, featureless void of white and wind. The cold was a physical predator, biting at any exposed skin, seeping through my layers with a relentless chill. This is how it happens, I thought. This is how the woods claim you. I pulled out my compass, the one I'd relied on for decades, a beautiful brass instrument my father had given me. The needle was useless. It spun wildly, erratically, as if the magnetic north of the planet had simply ceased to exist. I was lost. Truly, fundamentally lost. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat, but I forced it down. Panic is a death sentence out here. I tried to find a natural shelter, a rock outcropping, anything, but there was only the suffocating whiteness. My movements became sluggish. The cold was moving from my skin to my bones, to my very core. I thought of my father. Did he feel this? This slow, inevitable surrender to the cold? This crushing loneliness at the end of everything? I stumbled, my legs clumsy and unresponsive, and fell into a deep drift. I didn't have the strength to get up. I was going to die here. And as I lay there, my life slipping away into the white noise of the storm, I heard it. A sound that cut through the howl of the wind. A low, guttural growl. So deep I felt it in my chest more than I heard it with my ears. It wasn't a snarl of aggression. I know what that sounds like. This was different. It was a sound of direction, of command. I managed to lift my head, my vision blurring. At the very edge of my sight, a shape moved. A massive, dark form, a piece of the night sky torn out and set against the white chaos of the blizzard. It was a shadow made of muscle and fear, and it was watching me. It growled again, a rumbling inquiry. I was too weak to feel fear anymore. There was only the cold, and this impossible presence. This was the moment of truth. My life's hunt, ending with me as the helpless prey. But it didn't advance on me. It took a step back, a deliberate, intelligent movement, and then another, melting into the curtain of snow. It was leading, not chasing, not threatening, but guiding. I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was the last spark of my 43-year-old obsession. Maybe it was just the animal instinct to live. But I got to my feet. I followed the shadow. It kept to the edge of my vision, a fleeting darkness in the storm. Always just far enough ahead that I couldn't make out its form, but close enough that I didn't lose it. It nudged me with its presence, herding me with a strange, silent insistence. It led me along a ridge I didn't know existed, until the sound of the wind changed, joined by the muffled thunder of falling water. It led me to a cave, perfectly hidden behind a massive, frozen waterfall. I collapsed inside the entrance, the roar of the blizzard instantly softening to a distant whisper. The air inside was still and cold, but it was a dry, survivable cold. The dark shape was gone. It had delivered me to safety and then vanished as if it had never been. I lay on the stone floor, my body shivering uncontrollably, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The thing I was hunting, the monster from the stories, had saved my life. It had shepherded me, a lost lamb, from the storm. Why? The question burned in my mind, brighter than the cold. Why lead me and why save me? The silence in that cave was profound, ancient. It was the silence of a place that had seen ages pass. I had survived, but my world was shattered. The lines between hunter and hunted, between monster and savior, had been completely erased. When I woke hours later, the storm had broken. pale light filtered through the ice of the frozen waterfall, filling the cave with a soft, blue glow. My limbs were stiff. My body ached with a deep, profound exhaustion. But I was alive. The first coherent thought that formed in my mind was not one of fear, but of debt. A life had been given back to me. A debt had been incurred. The rules of the wild are simple and brutal, and this was the oldest rule of all. A gift must be repaid. I fumbled in my pack, my fingers numb and clumsy. I had a small piece of salted venison heart left, wrapped in waxed paper. It was my last bit of real food, the most nutrient-rich part of the deer I'd taken weeks ago. It was precious. It was a fitting offering. I would not hunt this thing. I would pay my respects. The hunt was over. Something else was beginning. I walked to the entrance of the cave. Just outside, there was a large, flat stone, covered in a patch of green moss that had somehow survived the frost. It felt significant, like an altar placed there by nature itself. I unwrapped the piece of venison. It was dark red against the white snow. I placed it carefully in the center of the stone. There were no words, no ceremony. It was a simple, silent act, a gesture of gratitude, an acknowledgement of the power I had witnessed. I stood there for a long moment, the cold air stinging my lungs. Then I turned and walked away, back toward the direction I thought my cabin was. I did not look back. I felt its eyes on me. I knew it was watching. But I didn't look. I had left my offering. The next move was its. A new rule was being written, and I was determined to follow it. The week that followed was the longest of my life. Back in my cabin, with the familiar scent of wood smoke and old books, the event in the blizzard felt like a fever dream. Did it really happen? Had I hallucinated the whole thing from the cold? The doubt was a poison seeping into my thoughts. I cleaned my rifle. I chopped wood. I tried to fall back into the comforting rhythms of my solitary life. But it was no use. The image of that dark shape, the sound of that directional growl, the impossible fact of the cave. It was all I could think about. The question of the offering consumed me. Would it be there? Would it be taken? Or would I go back to find it frozen solid, untouched, proof that I was just a crazy old man losing his mind in the woods? The suspense was a physical weight. My entire reality hinged on what I would find on that moss-covered stone. Finally, after 7 days, I couldn't wait any longer. I made the journey back. I didn't take my rifle this time. I left it leaning by the cabin door. This felt important, a gesture of trust, an acknowledgement that our relationship had changed. This wasn't a hunt. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't that. The hike was different this time. The forest felt neutral again. The birds were back. The squirrels chattered in the branches. The symphony had returned. As I got closer to the frozen waterfall, my heart hammered in my chest. I rounded the last bend in the trail and saw the stone. My breath caught in my throat. The venison heart was gone. Not dragged away, not torn at by scavengers. The waxed paper I had wrapped it in was folded neatly to one side. It was simply gone, taken, accepted. But that wasn't what made me stop in my tracks. In the exact center of the stone, where the heart had been, sat a single object. It was a river stone, worn perfectly smooth and round, a deep, glossy black. It wasn't a random rock. I've spent my life in these woods. I know the geology. This type of stone wasn't found in this part of the forest, and it was polished, not by water, but by something else. It had the finish of an object that has been held and turned over and over again in a hand or a paw for years. It was a deliberate gift, a receipt, a reply. I picked it up. It was cold and heavy in my palm, a solid piece of the mystery itself. I had made an offering, and the offering had been answered. This was a language, and I was just beginning to learn the words. This became our ritual, our silent, unbreakable pact. Once a week, I would return to the stone by the frozen waterfall. I learned the rules without them ever being spoken. I never went near the cave itself. That was its space, its sanctuary. I never brought my rifle to the exchange. This was a place of truce, not violence. And I never, ever stayed after the sun began to dip below the ridgeline. The night belonged to it. I would leave something of my world. Sometimes it was food, smoked fish, a block of suet. Other times, it was an object I thought might be interesting. A few spent brass casings from my rifle, gleaming in the sun. A small whittling of a bird I had carved from a piece of pine. It was my way of showing my own intelligence, my own nature. I was leaving pieces of myself on that stone, and it always replied. The trade was always honored. When I left the brass casings, I returned to find the skull of a bobcat, picked clean of every fiber of flesh and sinew, bleached white by the sun. It was a perfect specimen, a masterpiece of natural decay. When I left the carved bird, I returned to find a cluster of rare chaga mushrooms, the kind that only grow high up on ancient birch trees in deep, inaccessible ravines I couldn't possibly reach. They were a powerful medicine, a treasure of the forest. The creature wasn't just leaving trinkets, it was leaving things of value, things that showed an intimate, profound knowledge of the woods. It was showing me things about my own territory that I never knew. I was the best tracker in Manistee. Bashuke was Shefhini Tortis. But I was a student now. I was no longer hunting it. I wasn't even just studying it. I was tending to it. This silent, weekly exchange became the new rhythm of my life, the central pillar holding up my world. My obsession with my father's disappearance hadn't faded, but it had transformed. It was no longer a hot, angry grief. It was a patient, quiet curiosity. The creature, this Dogman, was no longer a monster to be slain or a mystery to be solved. It was a presence, a dark, powerful neighbor, a silent partner in a strange and sacred contract. I stopped telling people I was going out to hunt. I just went. The need for an alibi was gone. My purpose was now so private, so far beyond their understanding, that lying felt pointless. A trade is a trade, and the one I was making, out there at the edge of the human world, felt like the most honest thing I had ever done. The years began to blur into this strange, secret rhythm. My calendar was no longer marked by months, but by my weekly pilgrimage to the stone. My life, which had been a straight, hard line of grief and pursuit, now had a gentle, circular pattern to it, a quiet purpose. The exchanges deepened. I left a small, hand-forged flint and steel, and in return, I found a perfect arrowhead carved from obsidian, a material that doesn't exist naturally for 1,000 miles. It was ancient, impossibly sharp, a relic from a time before this forest was even named. I was learning that my partner in this trade wasn't just an animal of profound intelligence. It was a historian, a curator of the wood's deepest secrets. Every gift it left was a new chapter in a book I was only just beginning to comprehend. A book written in stone and bone. It was teaching me its language, and the grammar was made of things left behind. One afternoon, the lesson became startlingly clear. I was in my hunting blind, a small, elevated platform overlooking a natural clearing, not hunting, but simply observing. The air was still. Suddenly, a large black bear, a young male, ambitious and reckless, ambled into the clearing. He caught my scent and began circling the base of my tree, agitated. He started clawing at the ladder, rocking the platform with his weight. My rifle was back at the cabin, a rule of my own making I now regretted. He was getting more aggressive, his huffs turning to low growls. I was trapped. Just as the bear reared up to put its full weight against the ladder, a sound ripped through the forest, a series of deep, guttural howls, so powerful they seemed to vibrate the wood of my blind. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. It was the sound from the blizzard. A command. The bear froze instantly. It dropped to all fours, its ears flat against its skull. It gave a nervous look toward the direction of the howl, a sound I could now place as coming from the ridge near the cave. It let out a soft, submissive woof, turned, and crashed back into the undergrowth, fleeing as if the devil himself were on its heels. Silence returned to the clearing, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a protected space. I sat there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. It had been watching me. It knew my blind, it knew my routines, and when a threat appeared, it had intervened. This wasn't a trade anymore. This was an alliance. We were sharing this territory, and it was clear which of us was the true guardian. The woods have rules, and the most important one was becoming clear. It protected its own. My role in our pact had shifted. I was no longer just leaving offerings of gratitude. I was contributing to the upkeep of our shared sanctuary. I began clearing fallen branches from its known paths, not the main trails, but the secret ways I had seen it move. I would leave bundles of dry tinder near the cave entrance before a big storm was forecast. small gestures of a groundskeeper, tending a garden he did not own but deeply respected. The rewards became more personal. It left a perfectly intact eagle feather, a sacred object. It left a fossilized fern, a print of a world millions of years old. I began to feel less like a man hiding a secret and more like a priest tending a temple. My obsession with my father hadn't vanished. It had been absorbed into this larger, more immediate duty. I was protecting the very thing he had died searching for. Then came the day that changed everything again. The day the pact went from being about the forest to being about my own past. I had left a small, intricately carved wooden fish on the stone, something I'd spent a dozen winter evenings working on. When I returned 7 days later, the fish was gone. In its place was a piece of metal, dark and misshapen with rust. It was a belt buckle, rectangular, brass, with a simple utilitarian design. I picked it up, and my fingers went cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The rust was thick, but I could still feel the familiar heft of it, the specific way one of the corners was bent from when my father used it to pry open a crate. I turned it over in my trembling hand. There, on the back, faint but unmistakable, were his initials, W.A. William Arthur, my father's. I sank to my knees, the forest floor spinning around me. 43 years. 43 years of searching, of wondering, of imagining 1,000 different ends for him, and here was the first, tangible piece of his final moments. And it was given to me by the very creature I had blamed for his absence. It wasn't a trophy. The way it was placed, so deliberately in the center of the stone, felt like something else. It felt like an answer, or maybe a question. The weight of that small key, rusted buckle in my pocket was heavier than my rifle, heavier than all the secrets I had carried for my entire adult life. I had followed my father's ghost into these woods, and his ghost had finally handed me a piece of himself. A trade is a trade. But what had my father traded for this? And what was this creature telling me by giving it back to me now? The years of my strange, quiet peace were over. The buckle had reawakened the old hunt, but now it was laced with a terrifying new complexity. I was no longer just tending to a mysterious neighbor. I was in communication with the last thing that had seen my father alive. But before I could even begin to process this, the outside world, which I had so successfully kept at bay, began to push its way in. It started small. More tourists than usual that summer, their loud voices and bright jackets a jarring intrusion. They left trash, beer cans, and plastic wrappers near the trails. I found myself cleaning up after them, a bitter resentment growing in my gut. They were desecrating my church. They were loud, blind, and stupid. They saw the woods as a playground, not a presence. They were a nuisance, but they were just the first wave. The real threat arrived with a professional hum, a team of surveyors from a logging company in Grayling. I saw their trucks on the old fire roads, their fluorescent vests like ugly wounds against the green and brown of the forest. Soon, their work became visible. Bright pink ribbons of surveyor's tape started appearing, tied to ancient oaks and hemlocks, marking a path of destruction right toward the high country, toward the ridge, toward the cave. They were mapping the area for clear-cutting. To them, this was just a quadrant on a map, a collection of bored feet waiting to be harvested. They couldn't hear the silence. They couldn't read the language of the stones. They saw only profit, and their ignorance was more dangerous than any predator. Then came the drones. At first, it was a distant, high-pitched whine, a sound so alien it made the hair on my arms stand up. A mechanical wasp buzzing above the canopy. I saw it one afternoon, a black quadcopter hovering over the valley, its camera an unblinking, analytical eye. I instinctively ducked behind a tree, feeling violated, watched by something with no soul. A few days later, during my weekly trip to the stone, I saw the creature's reaction. As the drone's buzz grew louder, approaching the ridge, I saw a flicker of movement from the shadows near the waterfall. A massive, dark shape, retreating deeper into the blackness of the cave. It wasn't just my sanctuary being threatened, it was the creatures. And the drone, with its cold, technological gaze, was a threat it couldn't fight with howls or claws. It was afraid of it. That fear became my fear. A protective rage began to build in me, something primal and hot. It was no longer about finding my father. It was about protecting his legacy, this impossible, sacred thing he had found. What was it guarding so fiercely up there? Why did the mechanical buzz of a surveyor's drone send a creature of such power into a panicked retreat? I started to understand that some patterns are invisible to men with maps. They don't see the ancient trades, the silent pacts, the history written in the rocks. They see only what they can take. The world has a long reach, and its fingers were now stretching into the one part of my life that was pure. I would not let them touch it. I had to do something. The vow I made was no longer to find the truth, but to protect it. The moment of decision came on a crisp, clear afternoon. The drone was back, but this time it was bolder. It wasn't surveying the valley. It was flying a direct, aggressive line along the ridge, hovering directly over the area of the frozen waterfall. The buzzing was no longer a distant annoyance. It was a loud, invasive presence, an interrogation from the sky. I could see it from my position half a mile away, a black speck darting back and forth right above the cave. I imagined the creature cowering in the darkness, trapped by this buzzing mechanical wasp. A panic I hadn't felt since the blizzard seized me. They were getting too close. They were going to find the cave. They were going to ruin everything. I had to make it stop. My rifle was out of the question. A gunshot would bring them running, confirming their suspicions that something was worth investigating in this empty stretch of forest. I needed to be a ghost. I needed to use the forest's own weapons. My hand closed around the slingshot I always carried in my pack, a habit from boyhood. It was a beautiful thing, a forked branch of ironwood I had sanded smooth, fitted with powerful latex bands. I searched the ground and found a perfect stone from a creek bed, heavy and round, a small instrument of chaos. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against the buzzing of the drone. I was about to cross a line, a barrier between my secret world and their world of laws and consequences. But there was no choice. To protect the pact, I had to break the rules of men. I moved quickly, using the terrain for cover, until I was on a small bluff directly across the ravine from the hovering drone. It was about 60 yards away, a difficult shot, but my entire life had been about judging distance and wind. I placed the stone in the leather pouch, drew the bands back to my cheek, the latex straining. I took a breath, held it, and released. The stone flew, a silent, deadly arc against the blue sky. I didn't see the impact, but I heard it. A sharp thwack, followed by a high-pitched, sputtering whine. The drone wobbled, one of its rotors shattered. It spun out of control, careening wildly before crashing down through the canopy of trees below, ending with a definitive splash as it hit the creek at the bottom of the ravine. And then, silence. A profound, ringing silence. The mechanical wasp was dead, but as the adrenaline faded, a cold dread took its place. I hadn't solved a problem. I had created a new, more dangerous one. That drone cost thousands of dollars. The logging company wouldn't just write it off. They would come looking for it. They would find it. They would see it had been brought down deliberately. And then, they would start looking not for trees, but for the person who had done it. I had just declared war. I had thrown a rock at a hornet's nest, and I had done it right on the doorstep of the one place on earth I needed to keep hidden. The price for my act of protection was the loss of my anonymity. I was no longer a ghost. I was a saboteur, and I knew they would be coming for me. Winter came early and hard that year, a punishment for my hubris. The logging company found their drone, of course, broken and half-submerged in the creek. The official word in town was vandalism, maybe eco-protesters, but I felt their attention shift. Before, they were looking at the trees. Now, they were looking for a ghost. I saw their trucks parked more often on the access roads, men walking the property lines with a new kind of focus. My paranoia became a constant, low-grade fever. Every snap of a twig, every distant engine sound was them. Closing in, I retreated further into my solitude, my trips to the stone now fraught with a new kind of danger. I was no longer just protecting a secret. I was hiding a crime. The woods that had been my sanctuary were slowly, inexorably becoming a cage, and the walls were made of their patient, methodical searching. The world has a long reach, and I had foolishly invited it in. The first major ice storm of the season hit in early December. The forest was transformed into a treacherous cathedral of glass. Every branch, every pine needle, was coated in a thick, heavy layer of ice. The sound of the woods changed. Instead of the gentle rustle of leaves, there was a constant, fragile cracking, like the whole world was made of breaking glass. It was beautiful and deadly. Against my better judgment, I went out. I told myself I was checking my snares, but the truth is, I was checking my perimeter, looking for any new signs of the loggers. I was walking a familiar ridgeline, the ice crunching loudly under my boots, when I heard a sound that was different from the gentle crackle. It was a deep, groaning snap from above, a sound of immense weight finally giving way. I didn't even have time to look up. The weight that hit me wasn't a sharp blow, it was a crushing, final force. A massive branch from an old-growth oak, laden with hundreds of pounds of ice, had broken free. It didn't just strike me, it pinned me. My left leg was caught between the main trunk of the branch and the frozen ground. The pain was immediate and absolute. A hot, blinding fire in my tibia that eclipsed the frigid air. I screamed, a raw, animal sound that was swallowed by the indifferent, icy woods. I tried to push, to dig myself out, but the branch was immovable, a dead weight of wood and ice. My leg was trapped at an unnatural angle, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the bone was shattered. The initial shock gave way to a cold, clear terror. I was miles from my cabin. No one knew where I was. And the temperature was still dropping. The cold began its work immediately. My focus narrowed to the searing pain and the encroaching numbness. I thought of my father. I thought of him dying alone in the snow, a victim not of a monster, but of the simple, brutal arithmetic of the wild. Exposure, injury, the slow, creeping cold that drains your strength, then your hope, then your life. The irony was so bitter it felt like acid in my throat. I had spent my life trying to solve the mystery of his death, only to replicate it perfectly. My own life had become an echo of his. As the hours passed, the pain in my leg became a distant, throbbing thing, secondary to the aggressive cold that was now deep in my bones. My shivering slowed, a dangerous sign. My thoughts grew sluggish and disconnected. My vision began to dim at the edges, the glittering ice of the forest dissolving into a soft, gray haze. I was dying. And in the end, there was no monster, no great secret, just a stupid, lonely death in the cold. As my consciousness began to flicker and fade, a new sensation cut through the gray fog. A smell, hot, foul breath on my face, a rank odor of wet fur and raw meat. I felt a wet nose nudge my cheek, insistently. Through the haze, I saw a pair of eyes, glowing with a faint, internal light, like embers in the dark. They were not the cold, predatory eyes of a wolf. They were something else, intelligent, focused. I heard a low whine, a sound of canine distress. It was the creature, the Dogman. It loomed over me, a colossal shadow against the fading light. I felt no fear. There was no room left for it. I had reached the end. My last sight would be the face of the thing I had hunted for a lifetime. I closed my eyes, ready for the final, tearing pain, but it didn't come. Instead of the bite of teeth, I felt a strange, careful pressure. It nudged my trapped leg with its snout, whining again, a sound of frustration. Then, with a grunt of effort that seemed to shake the ground, it braced its massive shoulders against the branch. I heard the groan of wood, the crackle of ice, and felt the immense pressure on my leg lessen just enough. It wasn't brute force, it was leverage, it was intelligent. With another surge of effort, the branch shifted, and my leg was free. The pain returned in a blinding, nauseating wave. I must have blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I knew, I was being moved. I was being dragged, not torn, not savaged, but pulled with a strange, desperate strength. My head lolled, and I caught a glimpse of a massive, furred shoulder, muscles bunching and straining as it hauled my dead weight through the snow and ice. I woke up on my own porch. The world was a blur of pain and confusion. I was lying on a makeshift bed of soft pine boughs, piled thick to keep me off the frozen wood. My mangled leg was propped up on another, smaller pile, elevated and straight. The front door of my cabin was pushed ajar, the frame splintered where it had clearly been forced open. The creature had not just saved me from the forest. It had brought me home. It had dragged me for miles, navigated to my cabin, forced its way inside to get me out of the elements, and arranged me with a strange, almost tender level of care. It had faced the storm that I, with all my human knowledge, had succumbed to. It had brought me to the one place it had always avoided. This act of mercy broke something in me. The hunter inside me died on that porch. The obsession that had driven me for 43 years evaporated, leaving behind only a profound, aching sense of awe and debt. The weeks of my recovery were a time of stillness and quiet revelation. Trapped in my cabin, my legs splinted and bound, I had nothing to do but think. The world outside was a muffled landscape of snow and silence. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my home, and to the contents of a small wooden box I kept on the mantel. In it, I had kept every object the creature had ever left for me on the stone. The polished river stones, the bobcat skull, the obsidian arrowhead, the fossilized fern, the strange pieces of wood carved with markings I'd never understood. For years, I had seen them as individual gifts, a collection of curiosities, a testament to our strange pact. But now, laid low and with nothing but time, I saw them with new eyes. They weren't just gifts. They were sentences. One afternoon, fueled by a potent mix of cabin fever and laudanum for the pain, I took the box and emptied its contents onto the large wooden table in the center of my cabin. I arranged the objects, not by size or type, but by the order in which I had received them. Polished stones, strangely carved pieces of wood, fossilized bones, the eagle feather. A history of our silent conversation. It wasn't a collection, it was a vocabulary. And for the first time, I wasn't just looking at the objects. I was looking for a pattern. I started to see it. The carvings on the wood weren't random scratches. They depicted star constellations, specifically the ones visible in the winter sky over Michigan. The polished stones, laid out in sequence, mirrored the major geological veins of iron and copper in the region. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was a map. The pieces clicked into place with a sudden, breathtaking clarity. The constellations provided the orientation. The carved sticks were the trails and ridges. The stones marked specific geological features. It was a map of its territory, a map made of the forest itself. And all the lines, all the markers, all the constellations, they all pointed to one single, unambiguous location, an abandoned copper mine, not 3 miles from the cave. Deep in a part of the forest, the logging maps marked as structurally unstable. It was a place locals had avoided for a century, a place surrounded by old stories of cave-ins and bad air, a scar on the land that had never healed. The creature wasn't just a beast hiding in the woods. It wasn't just my silent partner. It was a warden, and it had just given me the key to whatever it was guarding. The revelation left me breathless. It had saved my life not just out of some animal instinct, but because it had more to tell me. My rescue wasn't the end of a chapter. It was an invitation to the final one. It was never about the hunt. It was never about my father's death. Not really. That was just what had put me on the path. The real story was what my father had found. What he, and now this creature, were protecting in that mine. The creature's mercy had done more than save my body. It had saved me from my own blind obsession. It had given me the one thing I never knew I needed, the right question. Not, what happened to my father, but what was he willing to die for? The answer, I knew, was waiting in the dark. If this story has found a hold in you, if you've ever felt like you were on the edge of a truth you couldn't quite see, then do me a kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who knows that the most important maps aren't made of paper. You need to stay until the very end, because my journey to that mine reveals a secret that is so much bigger than a creature in the woods. It's a secret about what we're willing to do for power, and the price that we all end up paying. And the authorities are coming. The final confrontation is about to begin. My recovery was a slow, painful process, but the broken bone in my leg was nothing compared to the fracture in my understanding of the world. Just as I was starting to walk without a limp, just as I was planning my first trip back to the stone with a new sense of purpose, the outside world finally knocked on my door. Literally. A sharp, confident rap that was out of place in my quiet hollow. It was the logging company. They had filed a formal complaint about the destroyed drone and the repeated signs of local interference. The complaint had brought the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. My act of defiance hadn't scared them off. It had brought in the cavalry. I opened the door to a young man who didn't look like any ranger I'd ever seen. He was my age now, but carried none of the weariness. He looked sharp, academic. The world has a long reach, and its arm was now standing on my porch, holding a clipboard. His name was Thorne. Dr. Thorne, he corrected me. a biologist specializing in ecosystem disruption. He wasn't armed with a gun, but with a terrifying, cheerful skepticism. He said the logging company's report was just an excuse. His real interest was what he called an anomalous predator void in this specific sector. He'd been studying satellite data and historical trapping records for a 50-square-mile area, with my cabin at its epicenter. There was a statistically impossible lack of large predators. No bears, no wolf packs, not even a resident cougar. It's like something has scrubbed the top of the food chain clean, he said, his eyes scanning the woods behind my cabin. Nature abhors a vacuum, Arthur. So, what's filling it? His questions were like surgical instruments, probing for a weakness in my story. I was no longer a quiet hunter. I was a data point that didn't fit his model. He was an antagonist my slingshot couldn't touch. He was authority, armed with science. The pressure mounted with his visits. He was clever, never accusing me directly about the drone. Instead, he'd ask about my hunting patterns, my knowledge of the local terrain, all while his eyes missed nothing. He mentioned offhandedly that the logging company had a secondary interest beyond timber, mineral rights. They were petitioning the state to reopen some of the old, abandoned mines in the area, including the one I now knew was the center of everything. Their geological surveys show some interesting magnetic anomalies around the old North Ridge copper mine, he said, watching my face for a reaction. Probably just iron deposits, but you know how these companies are. They'll tear down a mountain for a rumor. He was baiting me, testing me. I felt the paranoia creeping in, a cold sweat on my back. My lies had to be perfect. Every word was a step in a minefield. The weight of what I was protecting was becoming immense. The surveillance started subtly. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched, but this time it wasn't the creature. It was him. Then I started finding the physical signs. A small, brightly colored flag tied to a rare species of orchid, miles from any trail. A core sample taken from the soil near a game path, the hole neatly plugged. Then came the trail cams. I found the first one by accident, its dark plastic casing almost perfectly camouflaged against the bark of an oak tree. Its small, and a tutur. Black lens was a soulless eye, recording everything that passed. My sanctuary, the church where I had practiced my secret religion for years, was being wired for sound and video. I felt a surge of rage, a feeling of profound violation. I was a ghost in my own home, and Thorn was the exorcist, determined to expose me to the harsh light of his data. The forest was no longer a refuge, it was a witness box. The ritual was the first casualty. I couldn't risk the weekly pilgrimage to the stone. A trail cam could be anywhere along the route. Thorn could be watching in person. The thought of him discovering the cave, of him finding one of the creature's gifts, was unbearable. So, I stopped going. The silence that followed was a new kind of torture. It was an absence. No more exchanges, no more silent conversations. Did the creature understand? Did it think I had abandoned it after it had saved my life? Did it stand watch over the stone, waiting for an offering that never came? The guilt was a heavier burden than the fear of being caught. My pact, the central pillar of my existence, was crumbling under the pressure of Thorn's relentless, quiet investigation. I had broken the rules of men to protect the pact, and now I had to break the pact itself to protect the secret. The scale of the operation began to grow. It wasn't just Thorn and his clipboard anymore. I started seeing official DNR trucks on the old logging roads, sometimes accompanied by vehicles with UAS, geological survey markings on the side. Federal interest. The words echoed in my mind. They were bringing in equipment I didn't recognize, things with antennas and sensor arrays. One evening, from a high ridge, I watched them use what looked like ground-penetrating radar, dragging a small device back and forth across a clearing. Their faces illuminated by the green glow of a screen. They were mapping the unseen world beneath the forest floor. They were methodically, scientifically, closing in on the mine. My secret world was being invaded by a force I couldn't comprehend, let alone fight. It felt like watching an iceberg move, slow and unstoppable, destined to crush everything in its path. I was just one man. They were a system. The paranoia became a constant companion, a shadow that followed me even inside my own cabin. I started sleeping in shifts, waking at the slightest sound. I'd spend hours watching the tree line from my window, looking for a glint of light, a flicker of movement. One night, Driven by a desperate need to know how close they were, I moved through the woods toward the cave. I moved like a whisper, every step deliberate. As I got closer, I saw it, the intermittent beam of a flashlight, cutting through the darkness near the frozen waterfall. They were there, Thorn's team. I dropped to my belly, my heart pounding against the frozen earth. From the corner of my eye, I saw a darker shadow detach itself from the rock face near the cave entrance and retreat silently into a deep fissure. We were both there, hiding in the dark, watching the same intruders. In that moment, the bond was absolute. We were two creatures being cornered in our own home. Thorn came to my cabin one last time. The friendly, academic mask was gone. He was all business. He laid a photograph on my table. It was a grainy image from one of his trail cams, showing the back of a figure in a heavy coat. Beside it, he placed a clear photo of a boot print. "The tread matches the old Red Wing boots on your porch, Arthur," he said, his voice flat. "Interfering with a federally licensed survey operation is a serious offense. We can make this all go away. We just need to know what's out here. What are you protecting?" The threat was laid bare. Prison, or I could become his native informant, lead him right to the heart of my secret. It was a classic interrogation tactic. Isolate, pressure, offer a deal. The moral weight was crushing. To save myself, I had to betray the creature that had saved me. My silence was no longer a shield. It was an admission of guilt, and he knew it. He must have seen the resolve in my face, because he played his final card. "This isn't just about the logging company anymore," he said, leaning in. "Their initial surveys, combined with my environmental data, we found something. An energy signature and a gravitational anomaly centered on that old copper mine. It doesn't match any known geology. The USGS is calling it a Priority 1 Strategic Resource Query. They think there's something in that mine, Arthur. Something far more valuable than copper." That was it. The final piece. They weren't just curious. They were greedy. They had seen the shadow of the treasure on their instruments, and now they were coming to dig it up, to claim it, to own it. The creature wasn't just a warden of a place. It was the guardian of a resource they now wanted. Its fear of their drones, their technology, suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't afraid of them. It was afraid of what they would do if they found what it was protecting. I knew then that it was over. Hiding was no longer an option. They would get a warrant. They would bring in teams with drills and explosives. They would tear the heart out of that mountain to get to its secret. They would find the creature, and they would not see a guardian. They would see a specimen, or an obstacle. My quiet, careful world of trades and trust was about to be obliterated by the loud, brutal machinery of human ambition. The only way to save it, to save him, was to get there first. I couldn't let them be the ones to corner it. I had to do it myself. I would have to break our most sacred rule. I would take my rifle, and I would go to the mine. I would have to become the monster. I would hunt it one last time, not to kill it, but to scare it away. To make it flee so deep into the earth that they could never find it. To save it from my kind, I had to become the very thing I had stopped being, a hunter. I walked toward the mine with my father's rifle on my shoulder, its weight a familiar comfort and a profound betrayal. Each crunch of my boots on the frozen ground was a syllable in a profanity I was shouting at the forest, at the pact, at the last 40 years of my life. This was the ultimate violation of our truce. I was bringing a weapon to the sacred space, not for a trade, but for a threat. The air grew colder as I approached the mine's dark maw, a black wound in the hillside that reeked of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient. I paused at the entrance. The silence from within was not empty. It was a held breath. It knew I was here. It knew what I was carrying. I stepped out of the weak sunlight and into the absolute darkness, my own footsteps echoing unnaturally. This was the end of the hunt. I was cornering it not to claim a trophy, but to save it from the trophy hunters who were on their way, and I prayed it would understand the difference. I found it in a deep, wide shaft at the very back of the main tunnel. The beam from my headlamp caught the glint of its eyes first. Two glowing embers in the oppressive dark. It was backed against a solid wall of rock, with nowhere left to retreat. It was larger than I had ever allowed myself to truly comprehend, a towering silhouette of muscle and dark fur that seemed to absorb the light. My hands trembled as I raised the rifle, the metal cold against my cheek. This was the moment I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times, the climax of my life's pursuit. But the growl I expected never came. It didn't snarl or bare its teeth. It simply stood there, watching me. And its intelligent eyes were not filled with rage or fear, but with a terrible, ancient sorrow. It was the look of a condemned king. The sight broke my resolve. The hunter in me, the one I thought I'd resurrected for this final act, died all over again. I lowered the rifle, my heart aching with a grief I couldn't name. It recognized the shift in me. The tension in its massive shoulders eased, just slightly. Then, it did something that shattered the last remnants of my reality. It lifted a single, massive claw, a claw I knew could tear open a deer with a single swipe, and it reached for the rock wall beside it. It did not strike. It touched the stone gently at first, then began to scratch. The sound was sharp and rhythmic against the dripping silence of the mine, a desperate, scraping noise that was the sound of language being born. I watched, mesmerized. As my headlamp illuminated the lines it carved, a crude drawing appeared, a simple stick figure, clearly a man, holding his hands out. In his hands, he offered a small object that the creature depicted by scratching a radiant burst around it, a glowing rock, and the stick figure was offering this rock to a large, four-legged wolf. The sound of the claw on stone was a story being told in the only way it knew how. The frantic scratching continued, the story unfolding on its stone canvas. The next image showed the wolf from the first drawing, but it was changing. The front legs were elongating, the spine straightening. It was rising. The final drawing in the sequence was the creature itself, standing tall on two legs, a perfect, chilling match for the being in front of me. It was not a depiction of a species. It was a record of a transformation, a binding. This wasn't a monster born of nature. It was a guardian that had been made. After it finished the final line, it lowered its claw. It turned its head slowly, looked me directly in the eyes, and then pointed that same claw at its own chest. Then it pointed back to the final drawing, the wolf that walked like a man. There was no room for misinterpretation. It was telling me what it was. Not a beast, but a duty. A warden bound by some forgotten pact or ancient science to protect this place. Then, it gave me the final piece of the truth. It pointed one more time at the drawing of the glowing rock, the object that had started it all. It looked back at me, its sorrowful eyes seeming to pierce right through me, looking for some sign of understanding. Then, it lifted its great head and let out a sound that I will carry to my grave. It began as a low, mournful howl, a sound of pure canine loneliness that echoed through the mine shafts. But then the sound changed, twisted, modulated by an intelligence that had no right to be there. The howl became a word. It was distorted, guttural, a sound scraped from a throat not meant for speech, but it was unmistakable. It howled my father's name, William, a warning, a lament, a final, desperate plea from one guardian to the son of another. The payoff wasn't a monster. The payoff was a legacy, a truth about what humans will do for power, and the lonely sentinels they sometimes leave behind. Just as that impossible sound faded into the deep silence of the mine, the world outside crashed in. Bright, blinding beams of flashlights cut through the entrance of the shaft, pinning us both in their glare. DNR, Arthur, drop the rifle, now! It was Thorne's voice, amplified by the enclosed space, sharp and authoritative. The creature flinched, not from the guns, but from the intrusion. The moment was broken. It cast one last, lingering look at me, a look of profound loss and shared defeat. And then it moved. With a speed that defied its bulk, it turned and scrambled into a deep, narrow fissure in the rock face that I hadn't even seen. It didn't run. It dissolved into the darkness, swallowed by the earth itself. The flashlight swept the empty space, finally settling on me. I was alone, my father's rifle hanging uselessly in my hand. Standing before a rock wall covered in impossible freshly carved drawings. The hunt was over. I made my choice. It wasn't even a decision, it was an inevitability. As Thorne's team, armed and tense, moved in to surround me, I slowly placed the rifle on the ground and raised my hands. It was me, I said, my voice hoarse. All of it. Thorne's eyes flickered from me to the strange pictograms on the wall, a deep frown of confusion on his face. I didn't give him time to process it. I confessed to everything, destroying the drone, yes, scaring off the surveyors. I even confessed to the doe I'd found torn apart weeks ago, claiming I was practicing illegal hunting methods, trying to create a predator to scare everyone away. I built them a story of a bitter, territorial old man, a hermit driven mad by solitude. Then I gave them the final lie, the one big enough to shield the truth. The mine's unstable, I said, looking Thorn in the eye. Full of radon gas. My father told me about it. That's why the Fed sealed it back in the day. You start drilling in here, the whole ridge will come down. A trade is a trade. I was trading my reputation, my freedom, for a few decades of red tape. As they put the cold steel of the handcuffs on my wrists, my body sagged with the weight of my lie and the exhaustion of it all. They started leading me out, back toward the world of men and consequences. In the shuffle, my jacket pocket caught on a piece of rock, and something small and heavy fell out, landing on the dusty floor of the mine with a soft clink. Thorn, who was walking behind me, stopped. He bent down and picked it up. It was my father's rusted belt buckle. He turned it over in his palm, his flashlight beam focused on it. I watched his face change. The professional, analytical mask dissolved, replaced by a look of sudden, dawning shock. His light was catching the faint, but clear, insignia stamped on the back, the insignia of the U.S. Geological Survey. He recognized it. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The symbol of the Federal Survey team that had vanished without a trace in this very forest 50 years ago. Thorn looked from the buckle in his hand to my face, then back toward the dark fissure where the creature had disappeared. In that single, silent moment, a new truth passed between us. He understood. He knew I was lying about the radon gas. He knew my confession was a fabrication. And now, he knew why. My father wasn't some local hunter who got lost in a storm. He was a scientist, a member of that lost USGS team. He hadn't been hunting the creature. He had found what was in that mine. He had found the strategic resource, the glowing rock, and he had understood its power, or its danger, enough to become its first guardian. Thorn slowly placed the buckle into a small evidence bag, his movements stiff and deliberate. He was a man of data and facts who had just stumbled into a legend, and the evidence in his hand proved it was real. He knew I was protecting something, and for the first time, he looked at me not as a criminal, but as a man holding a terrible secret. My confession wasn't my punishment. My real punishment is living the rest of my days with the truth of what I saw in that mine, and knowing that I only cornered it to save it from my own kind. The greatest secrets aren't what we hide from the world, but the truths we can no longer hunt. I traded my freedom to protect a legacy, a pact started by my father and honored by a creature that the world would call a monster. As they led me away, I looked back at the forest one last time. It was quiet, indifferent, holding its secrets as it always had. I don't know what Thorn will do. I don't know if his report will bury the truth under my lie, or if the greed for a strategic resource will win out in the end. That is a burden he must now carry. My part is over. I finally finished my father's work. Some things are meant to be left alone, guarded in the dark, protected from the relentless reach of our own world. My story is done. I've set the weight down. The silence now is my own. If you've stayed with me this long, you understand that some truths are heavier than lies. Please, hit that like button if you felt the weight of it, and subscribe to the channel because there are more secrets out there in the dark. Share this with someone who knows that not all monsters are monstrous, and be sure to watch the next story that's about to appear on your screen. There's always another voice waiting to confess. Thank you for listening.